Okay, we are going to move on now to the next section of the study design, which is really about how cells communicate with each other. And it's a really, this topic is a really important introduction into a lot of what we'll be spending this term on. How hilarious is that? How do cells communicate with a cell phone? Oh dear. Obviously, it's not with a cell phone. We will be going through all of this. Now, I know that looks like a lot, but the study design likes to have lots of words in there. But really what we're looking at here is called cellular signals. So signals that are sent and received by cells. Today, we're just going to focus on the start here. So the sources and mode of transmission of various signaling molecules. So we're really just looking at types of signaling molecules. And some of them you've probably heard of before, some might be a bit new. And then we'll move on to the rest of these dot points next week. All of this really relates to homeostasis. So I think it's a good opportunity to just go over that very briefly again, revise your, review your definition of that, which we covered in year 11. But homeostasis is really about maintaining a constant internal environment despite changes in the external environment. And you often see it kind of represented as a bit of a graph like this. Certain things might increase and then decrease, increase, decrease, but the whole aim is achieving this balance or this equilibrium. In year 11, you looked at certain examples of that. What we move into now is looking at this really at the cell level as opposed to the organism level. So when we talk about these changes in the external environment, these can be a few different things. So something like light would be a change. So for example, when your eyes receive light, your pupils dilate, your eyes open up a bit. So that would be an example of a change causing a response. Another example would be temperature. When the temperature outside increases and your body temperature kind of goes up, responses happen to bring that temperature back down to 37.5 degrees. This last one here is probably a new term, and this is what we're focusing on. A change in the environment can be the presence of what is called a signaling molecule. So when certain molecules are around, certain changes occur. So like I said, we really focus on the cell level now, whereas things like when we looked at temperature regulation in year 11, that was more the whole body. So if we've got a cell and there's molecules around, they may act upon this cell and cause a response. And we'll look more at that idea of the stimulus and the response next week. What we're going to look at today are these. What are the types of molecules? So which things will cause cells to go through a response? So in your notes, you really should be heading this section, types of signaling molecules. So in general, signaling molecules are molecules that are sent from one cell to another or back to the original cell, but we'll look at that in a second. This is really, really important for most things that happen in our body. So in order for us to grow and develop, our cells need to receive signals. The same with immunity, to repair damaged tissue, and for homeostasis, like I said. So we've already looked at how cells perform certain things like produce proteins, but all of that originates from a signal that tells it to do that. A couple of terms we'll start using. So signal molecules arise from a source cell and act upon a target cell. Okay, so they come from somewhere and act on a cell somewhere. In order for this to happen, for a molecule to act upon a cell, the target cell must have a receptor that is specific to that signal. So if we think back to everything we've learned about proteins and about how their shape is so important, you may have guessed it, receptors are generally a type of protein. So they will have a specific tertiary or quaternary shape that makes them fit perfectly with a signal. And you may look at doing a little diagram like this in your notes. You could always take the one out of my slides and glue that into your notes, but this is a great example of this. We have an ascending cell or our source cell. It produces these little molecules, and then if the molecule fits perfectly with a receptor at a target cell, they will bind together and we'll get a response. Okay, over here we've got just another example of a different cell that doesn't have a receptor. So you could have hundreds of signaling molecules circling around it, but this cell will not take in those molecules or bind with those molecules because it doesn't have a receptor. Okay, so that's just the first important thing to note. This term ligand or ligand is basically just a molecule that binds with a bigger molecule. Don't worry too much about that today. We'll go across that again next week. But I just want you to understand the importance of receptors in terms of signaling molecules being able to bind. So we'll look at signaling molecules or cellular signals in a few different ways. So one way is to look at how far a molecule has to travel. So I'll get you to draw these in your notes or to use the ones I've got on the slides. So one type of cellular signal is an autocrine signal. Okay, auto, you may remember, we've seen this a bit before. Auto means self. Okay, if you see auto in biology, it usually means self. So an autocrine signal is when the signaling molecule is made in one cell and then it acts on that same cell. So if we imagine here we've got a cell, our DNA has been transcribed, we've made these little molecules at the ribosomes, they usually are proteins, so some signaling molecules are made here. Okay, those signaling molecules might leave the cell and then act upon the same cell. Okay, so they'll come back and stay within this cell. They may also act on a receptor that's inside the cell, but the important thing is that autocrine signals are produced in one cell and then act on the same cell. Paracrine signals, look at the word para. Para usually means parallel or next to. So a paracrine signal is when the signaling molecule acts upon a neighboring cell or a cell that's really close by. Okay, so we get our mRNA, makes our signaling molecule, signaling molecule leaves a cell and then acts upon the cell next to it. Okay, and it has to have that receptor. Our third type, and you may recognize this word, is an endocrine cell. And you may remember this from the endocrine system, and that is very related to this. An endocrine signal is when a signaling molecule is made in one cell. It travels in the blood, usually in the blood, sometimes in other fluid, and it acts upon a target cell that is far away from where that cell is, or not right next to it. Okay, so signaling molecule is made, it leaves the cell, it enters the bloodstream, travels in the blood, and then when it finds a cell, again with the same receptor, it will bind to that. Okay, and when we look at the examples in a minute, you may recognize some of these, but like I said, the endocrine system, if you remember, is responsible for. So VCAR specify that you need to know 5 types of signaling molecules. Okay, so these are actual molecules that act upon other cells. So we're going to go through each of these now. So we have animal hormones, plant hormones, neurotransmitters, pheromones, and cytokines. Okay, so some of these you may have heard of, some you might know a fair bit about, you might not know anything about some of them. So we'll go through them all now. Animal hormones are responsible for carrying out a huge number of functions in animals, including in us. Growth, development, they're involved obviously in regulating sexual function, they're involved in digestion of food. Hormones play a huge role in all kind of mammals and animals. Hormones are produced in glands. Okay, so you may have heard of things like the pituitary gland or the thyroid gland, even the pancreas is a gland. So they are produced in things called glands. They travel, so hormones travel in the bloodstream. Okay. Now, hormones can be endocrine, and that's if they travel kind of far away in the body. They can be paracrine, so they can act upon the neighboring cell. Or they can be autocrine, so some hormones are produced in one cell and then act upon themselves. Okay, usually they're endocrine. Most hormones are produced in one place, travel through the blood to another place, but they can be one of any of those 3. After they've traveled in the blood, they're received by their target cell. What does a target cell need to have in order to receive the signal? A receptor. Okay, so they're received by target cells, and there are 3 different types of hormones that are produced in animals. They can be lipid-based, so made mostly out of fats. They can be protein or peptide-based. The difference between a protein or a peptide-based hormone is really that the protein-based hormones are longer. You don't need to know too much about that, but I will explain why you need to know the differences between these 2. And you can also have what's called amino acid derived hormones, and they are very specific hormones that are just made from certain amino acids. I want to make a point here. You do not need to know the names or the actions of specific hormones. Okay, it comes up often in exams where the example will be about a specific hormone, but you'll be given the information you need to answer that. So you'll be told whether it's lipid-based or protein-based or other information that may be important. If you look at this diagram, we've got here a secreting cell. So our source cell is producing these hormones, the green things. They go into the bloodstream, they travel around, and when they find target cells with the specific receptor, they will bind with them. Okay. One other important thing to note is that some hormones will act upon different types of cells and produce different responses in those cells. Okay, but like I said, you don't need to know specific hormone names or what they do. In the textbook, you'll see there are some examples listed if you're interested, but you don't need to know that. These things will come up again next week when we look at the receptors that hormones bind with. Okay, but for now, just have this information in your notes. We also have plant hormones, and they are quite different to animal hormones. Again, they've got various functions which control things like the growth of the plant through cell division, things like ripening of fruit, and also movement, which I'll explain in a minute. You might not really think that plants move as such, but they actually do in the presence of some plant hormones. A big difference between animals and plants is that animals don't have an plants don't have an endocrine system or endocrine glands. So plant hormones are just produced in specialized cells. So all plant cells have the ability to produce hormones, and certain cells will produce certain plant hormones. Obviously, plants don't have a bloodstream, so the hormones can't travel in the blood, but they travel in the xylem and the phloem, which you may remember from year 11 when we looked at plant systems. But these are basically just the kind of vascular system of plants. So in the same way that water will travel through a plant or nutrients will travel through a plant, the plant hormones will travel through as well. Now, in the textbook and Enrollo this year, they've added in the 5 types of plant hormones. And they've made a note of saying that VCAR expect you to know the names of these. So I've got them in here and a really brief description of what their job is. I'll go through these quickly in a second. But I just want to point out, I've never seen plant hormones definitely come up in the exam, but I've never really seen questions with a huge amount of weighting where they ask you to know the different names of plant hormones. Now, because it's in the textbook, that may mean that it is a focus now. So I think you should definitely write these down. They have a little mnemonic that might help you to remember that. So to protect a plant, it needs a cage. So that's for the 5 names of the hormones. But the 5 different types are auxins, cytokines, abscisic acid, gibberellins, and ethylene. And these are briefly what they do. So auxins, and that's what this picture here is showing. Auxins are responsible for a process, and this is a pretty cool process in the biology world, called phototrophism. Basically what happens is when sunlight is received by a plant, by the tip of a plant, so like in this picture, these plant hormones called auxin, they move, you'll see they're moving here, away from where the sun is shining. So they're moving into the shaded area of the plant. And what they do when they get there is they tell the cells on this side of the plant to elongate, to get longer. And the cells on this side are just staying the same size. So it's almost telling the plant to stretch. And this is what I was talking about when I said plant movement. Telling the plant to stretch out, and what happens is the plant actually elongates and points toward the sun. Okay, so the tip of the plant ends up facing toward the sun where it can get the most amount of sunlight. So that's what phototrophism is. Cytokines are responsible for growth, so dividing the cells in plants. Abscisic acid regulates things like seed production or seed germination when plants are going to reproduce, or also they can tell seeds to become dormant, so basically to stop their function if there is no rain available for it to reproduce. There's also gibberellins involved in growth as well, And then ethylene is a hormone that's involved in the ripening of fruit or the loss of leaves according to the season that the plant is in. The third type of signaling molecule are neurotransmitters. You might remember hearing about these in Year 9 science when you looked at how nerves communicate, or if you're doing psychology, you'd probably know quite a lot about these. These are signaling molecules that are produced in neurons, so nerve cells, and they travel to the nerve cell or the neuron next to it. So they are a paracrine signal. Or if we're at the very end of the neuron chain, they'll communicate with the muscle cell or the gland that's at the end of that neuron. Okay, but they're always communicating with something next door to it. You do need to know the steps of how this occurs. It has come up in the exam quite a lot. So if we look down here, we've got neuron number 1 and neuron number 2. So we're looking at the signal that gets sent from the first neuron to the second one. And if you look at the kind of gap between these two parts of these two neurons, that is what is shown here. I'll just go through this. The signal, an electrical signal, travels down the first neuron along its axon. That is the long part of the neuron. So an electrical signal travels down there. Now, electrical signals can't jump from one neuron to the next. Okay, they can't conduct because there's a gap. So that's why we have neurotransmitters. So once this electrical signal gets down to the end here, to our axon terminal, which is shown here on that diagram, neurotransmitters are released. Okay, in this close-up, you can see there's these little sacs. They're vesicles, same as how we've looked at it when we've looked at the plasma membrane. So vesicles, and they have neurotransmitters inside. Okay, so the vesicle will fuse with the plasma membrane and it will release its neurotransmitters. Okay, so that is exocytosis. The neurotransmitters then will kind of diffuse across this gap. Okay, this gap is called a synapse. So the gap there, they diffuse across there until they bind with a receptor on the neuron next to it. Okay, so we had our first cell, they went across the synapse and then bind to the receptor on the second side, and that will actually cause the electrical signal to be traveled down that second neuron. Okay, next we've got pheromones. Now, pheromones are a very specific type of signaling molecule. They're involved mainly in communication and sexual attraction usually in insects, fish, and in some mammals. So an example, if anyone's got a dog, when dogs pee on things in the park, and you kind of call it they're marking their territory, they're actually in their urine, they're releasing things called pheromones that other dogs will kind of notice. So the pheromone is the signaling molecule. They are produced by what are called exocrine glands. Okay, so they're a bit different to endocrine glands. Now, the really unique thing about pheromones is they're released from one organism into the air, usually, or if it's with fish, it'll be into the ocean or into the water, and they're picked up by a different organism, usually of the same species. Okay, so in this example, we have this moth over here. Let's say, for example, this moth is ready for mating. It will release a pheromone, so these blue things, and then those pheromones are detected by a different moth. So the same species, but a different organism to attract it. And normally those pheromones are detected by the olfactory system, which is the glands in your nose. Fun fact, there's no concrete evidence that humans produce or receive pheromones. You've probably heard the term a lot. A lot of people talk about pheromones in relation to sexual attraction, and that, you know, people are attracted to smells of certain people because of their pheromones. Another theory that has been suggested is that women that live close to each other or in the same house, that their body will release pheromones that will make them menstruate at the same time. So, you know, if you live with sisters, or if you're a boy that's got sisters at home and you think they all go crazy at the same time every month, maybe they do. And that could be pheromones, but there's no clear evidence of that. But one study I read, which I love, was someone who was studying tears, so enzymes that are found in people's tears, and they suspect that there is a pheromone that is released in the tears of females, and what it actually does is reduce the testosterone levels of men around them. So the idea that if a female cries, that actually makes the men near them reduce their testosterone and be a bit nicer. So girls, if you're like getting your driver's license and you get pulled over by the cops for anything, just cry, because it might work. If it's a male cop, it might make them go, oh, poor her. Probably won't. It's not biological fact. Okay, our last signaling molecule that we're going to look at are called cytokines. We'll actually come back to these when we look at the immune system, because as you can see here, they are involved in various immune responses. So they're specific molecules that are only used in the immune system. Don't confuse them with cytokinins, which was one of the plant hormones. Okay, very similar name, but these are cytokines or cytokines. They're released by cells of the immune system, and they usually act either upon themselves, so they kind of work within one cell, or on a neighboring cell. So they're usually autocrine or paracrine. An example here is a killer T cell. Don't worry too much if you don't know what that is. We will spend a lot of time on the immune system in a few weeks. So this type of cell here releases what you can see are these cytokines over here, and they're actually being picked up by an infected cell. So a cell that has, say, a virus in it. So when these cytokines are received by that cell, they actually trigger the cell to destroy itself, to kill the virus that's inside. Okay, but like I said, don't worry too much about the details of that, because we're going to come back to that. But just make sure you include cytokines in your notes of signaling molecules. All right, this is just a summary of each of those 5 signaling molecules that we talked about. If you want to make a table to summarize that, you can. If you want to take this from my notes and print it out, you also can. Or if you think you've got all the information you need, that's fine. But that just summarizes what we have gone through. All right, a couple of practice exam questions here. So I'll ask you to pause the video now and have a read through both of these and see if you can answer them, and then come back and we'll go through them. So the first one, the olfactory part of the brain is responsible for an animal's ability to smell. The brain of a black flying fox has a relatively large olfactory lobe, indicating that these flying foxes rely heavily on smell to find their food. Now, a lot of people might see that or scan it and go, we're talking about animals, we're talking about the olfactory lobe. That's probably to do with pheromones, because we talked about how pheromones are received usually in the olfactory lobe. That's not even an option here, because what the question's actually asking is signals between neurons in the olfactory lobe would occur by what? Okay, so this is a great example of a question where you actually probably don't need any of that information. All it's asking is what are the types of signals between neurons? So they would be neurotransmitters. The next question, what is the general name for chemicals that act as sex attractants in many insects? Hopefully you got that, we just went through them. They are pheromones. Okay, you don't need to know specific ones, it's asked for the general name. And then this next one, a hormone was produced in one cell, entered the bloodstream, and travelled to two groups of cells that were next to each other. One of the groups of cells responded to the hormone, but the neighbouring one did not. Okay, so we've got one cell, it's released hormones through the bloodstream, and we've got two cells here, and one of these cells picks up the hormone, the other one doesn't. What is the most likely reason for this difference in response by cells to the same hormone? So hopefully you have picked up here that we're talking about the receptor. Okay, so one of these cells has a receptor and the other one doesn't. So one cell has receptors that are specific to that hormone, which allowed it to respond, or you could say it allows the hormone to bind while the other did not. Okay, it's only one mark. You need to use, so you would definitely have to use the term receptors in there to get that mark, and you would need to make it quite clear that that receptor is specific to the hormone that was sent. Okay, that's the end of the video for now. What you need to do is, firstly, there's a couple of videos that I posted in the class materials. They're really short videos. One of them is about hormones, and there's just some good animation in there. So that's about 5 minutes, but it shows quite well how hormones bind to the receptors of target cells. There's one about pheromones. It just shows how pheromones are being studied in ants. And then there's a nice little animation of neurotransmission, so how those neurotransmitters go from one axon to the next, from one neuron to the next. So watch those. Then I want you to jump into that Google form to do the exit ticket. That really will take you about 1 minute. It's purely what you learnt in this. If there was anything that was confusing or you need clarification on, and then just any feedback obviously on how this format is working, because it is new for all of us. And then I do want you to complete the review questions from the textbook. Okay, just a note on this. In your textbook, they're pages 268 to 272. A couple of things. I need you to do them on the Edrollo website, okay? If you go into the Edrollo website, scroll down, we've just looked at 8B. We're going to come back to this next week because I think that makes more sense when we do it with this. 8B is the section. If you want to watch those videos as well for clarification, you absolutely can. But I want you to go across to this bit where it says the 29 questions and click on that. Now I know that sounds like a lot of questions. See how you go with them. I definitely want you to do the first 16. Okay, so sorry, the first 15 you absolutely have to do. They are all multiple choice ones. The next 3, I think you should have a go if you can. They're kind of more extended response, so more like you would get in your exam. So If you want to do them in your book or in your notes, that's absolutely fine, but make sure you then go into here and just submit your answers on Edrollo, because I need that obviously to see how you're going, but I need to be checking that you're doing your work because we are still marking attendance. So the exit ticket and the Edrollo questions are what I am doing to keep track of that. And I can't really be changing your attendance, the week after. So I understand, obviously, this is a Friday afternoon class. You might not get all of this done by 4 p.m. today. So if you have it done by tomorrow or Sunday, I can go in and change that attendance. But in general, at the very least, get the exit ticket done straight away. And then work on your questions so I can say that you have done the work and engaged in it. All right, please give me feedback. I know this is very different for everyone. Hopefully this is going to be an okay format for us to go through things. But any questions or things that you need clarified, you can put obviously in the exit ticket or email me, and I'll start making an effort to address those in the next video or when we catch up on Google Meet. All right, take care everyone, and I'll chat to you soon.